In the last clip, we looked at the significance of John and who he was. I want to look in this clip now about looking at saying what was the significance of what he wrote. And the interesting thing is the number 7, because the number 7 recurs over and over and over within the Gospel of John. We see the 7 miracles that he performs. Only 7, some of which we find within the Synoptics, most of which we don't. That 7th miracle, the last miracle that he does before he moves towards Jerusalem, is in fact the raising of Lazarus from the dead. Now, often we talk about the resurrection of Lazarus, but I need to say that it's not a resurrection of Lazarus. Rather, we can call it the reanimation of Lazarus, the bringing back to life. It's not a resurrection. The resurrection, as far as Paul was concerned, and in many ways I think John as well, is really not about just bringing someone to life. Resurrection means to bring them into a new life, a new body, a new way of connecting. And we see that particularly at the end of John's Gospel, where Jesus comes back, and even though he's the same, he's also different. This is a new body, a new way of connecting with the world. So what Lazarus is Lazarus is a reanimation. He has the power to actually bring someone back from the dead. Someone to connect him again with life and to give life to someone again. That concept of giving life is part of the concepts of who Jesus is and what John feels Jesus does. Now, straight away, you need to realize that therefore John's gospel is trying to make a point. That other gospel writers got many, many different miracles and things that Jesus did. John's gospel decides only on 7. We remember that 7 is a number very important in the history of Israel, very important in the Tanakh. The number 7 is the number of divine completion, divine fullness, divine connection. That in a sense, that's the completion of the divine task. In the same way that the world was created in 7 days. In the same way, we see that the number 7 then continues through the book of John as well. You have the 7 I am sayings. 7 times Jesus says, I am. He says, I am the true vine. I am the shepherd. I am the gate. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the good shepherd. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. 7 I am sayings. What we see is that number 7 recurring over and over again as we look through the gospel. Now, why? Well, because John believed that Jesus was the divine completion of God. That Jesus was the one who would bring God's plan, that the whole plan of God, which was to reconcile us to Him, would be completed within the person of Jesus. That Jesus is the embodiment of God's answer. That in Jesus is the answer to our alienation from God. And we see that everything we then read within the Gospel of John is dealing with that concept of how Jesus is the fulfillment, of Jesus is the one who is the divine 7. He is the completion of all that God created, that our God made. But in a sense, what Jesus does in the time that He's on earth is to recreate that original creation which was marred at the fall. In the same way, that's the concepts of John. So straight away, right from chapter 1 though, we realize it says the Word was God and so on and so on. We see that immediately we get into something which is different. This is not a descriptive gospel where you've got physical descriptions. Rather, straight away, John is telling us that this is a symbolic gospel. It's about symbol. And the big problem with symbol, as we've said before in the various forms of writing, is that symbol is notoriously difficult to interpret. It's very difficult to interpret the various symbols of God because we don't always know what the symbol refers to or what part of the particular thing it refers to we need to understand. The other problem that we have as well is that, as I said last time, the gospel is written to Jews. And because it's written to Jews, it's therefore caught up within the culture and tradition of the Jews of that time. In that respect, when we try and interpret the symbols of that process, when we try and interpret the symbolic language of Judaism, often as Gentiles we miss the point. And I believe that's no more the case than with the I am sayings. I think for us as Christians, we look at the I am sayings and think, oh, isn't that wonderful? Jesus is the bread of life. Oh, let's eat the bread of life. But why isn't that not offensive? Because if you look further on in that section where Jesus calls himself the bread of life, he says, what is the bread of life? My flesh. And unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you can have no part in me. We need to see the offense that Jesus was creating by saying that. That when Jesus calls himself the bread of life, that straight away he's actually becoming offensive. And when John writes that down as one of the concepts that we need to understand, is he wants us to be offended. Because the thing that the symbols that he's using are the symbols that would actually rock the foundations of a Jewish person's thinking. It would rock their foundations, their prejudices, it would knock their concepts. The same thing is true for all the I am sayings. That when Jesus says, I am the good shepherd, he's harking himself, he's connecting himself to Psalm 23. But in Psalm 23 it says, the Lord is my shepherd. When he calls himself the good shepherd, what he's actually doing is he's actually putting himself in the position of God. Now for us, that's not blasphemous. For us as Christians who believe that Jesus is the Messiah, that Jesus is the Holy One, that Jesus is the Son of God, we're not offended at all. But you need to understand that the people who would have read this originally would have been greatly offended by it. They would have looked at it and said, how can he be saying these things? When he says, I am the light of the world, we need to see that he's actually saying to them that not only are they the chosen people, but that in fact he will be the light for all peoples. For a people like the Jews, who held so fiercely to their own culture, who held so fiercely to their status as being the chosen people. Can you see how offensive it would have been for John to tell them that Jesus in fact said that he's not just the light for them, but he's the light for the whole world? When we see those concepts attributed to Jesus, we need to realize that John's gospel is also trying to stir things up. It's trying to shake the foundations. And so what John has done is he's looking at this concept and saying, how is this going to shake us? How is this going to transform the way in which we understand faith, how we understand ourselves, and then how we put that into practice in the way in which we live out our faiths? All those things are part and parcel of the connections of Jesus. Of course, when we look at the ending of John's gospel, it's the ending of John's gospel from chapter 13 through to 17, which is just a wonder of prayer and of connection with God. That when we look at chapter 17, when he prays what we call now the high priestly prayer, in the sense, the reason why it's a high priestly prayer is because the high priest would go in to the Holy of Holies every year on the Day of Atonement and there make atonement, pray the prayer for and on behalf of the people. And in many ways, Jesus' prayer in chapter 17 is a very similar kind of prayer. It's a prayer where he prays to his Father, asking God to be with his disciples, asking God to be with the world that he will leave. It's a prayer that is wondrous. And the wonder that comes from it is because Jesus is looking after us, caring for us, and created the church so that we may care for each other. I don't think that we always listen so well to John. Maybe we should listen better.